The rain hammered the pavement like bullets as Detective Marcus Williams pulled his unmarked sedan to the curb on East 47th Street. His radio crackled with urgency. Shots fired, suspect fleeing on foot, all units respond. After 23 years on the force and 3 as chief of the Detroit Metropolitan Police Department, Marcus still felt that familiar surge of adrenaline when duty called. But tonight was different. Tonight he wasn't Chief Williams. He was just a black man in a hoodie, running through the rain toward danger, while his backup was still minutes away. The irony cut deep as Marcus stepped into the storm. Here he was, the city's top law enforcement officer, about to become a victim of the very system he had spent decades trying to reform. But he didn't know that yet. Right now, all he could think about was the dispatcher's words echoing in his mind. Multiple casualties reported. Hey, future crime fighters and justice seekers. If this story gets your heart racing, and you want more real stories about heroes who fight for what's right, smash that subscribe button right now. We're on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers who believe in justice, and your support helps us bring you the most gripping true stories every single week. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Marcus had been celebrating his daughter Sarah's master's degree in social work just 30 minutes earlier. The family dinner at Romano's Italian restaurant had been perfect. 3 generations gathered around one table, sharing stories and dreams. His grandson Jamal, now 15, had been telling everyone about his plans to follow in Grandpa's footsteps and become a police officer someday. "Grandpa, you think things will be different when I'm old enough to join the force?" Jamal had asked between bites of tiramisu. Marcus had looked into his grandson's earnest brown eyes, seeing both hope and the weight of generational trauma. "Son, I'm working every day to make sure they will be." Those words now felt prophetic as Marcus grabbed his service weapon from the glove compartment and pulled on his Michigan State hoodie. The thick cotton would provide some protection from the October rain, but it would also obscure the most important thing about him, his identity as Detroit's police chief. The Riverside Community Center was only 4 blocks away, but in this neighborhood, 4 blocks might as well have been 4 miles. This was the same area where Marcus had grown up, where his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep him off the streets, where he had made the choice between the badge and the corner at 17 years old. As he ran through the rain, Marcus's mind flashed to the community meeting he had attended here just last week. Residents had voiced their concerns about increased gang activity, about young people with nowhere to go after school, about the cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break. The center represented hope in a community that had seen too little of it. The sound of sirens grew closer as Marcus rounded the corner onto Riverside Avenue. Through the sheets of rain, he could see people scattering from the community center's vicinity. Some were running in panic. Others were trying to help what appeared to be wounded individuals near the building's entrance. That's when Marcus spotted him, a figure in dark clothing sprinting away from the scene, something metallic glinting in his hand. The suspect was heading toward the old warehouse district, a maze of abandoned buildings that had become a haven for drug dealers and criminals. Marcus's training kicked in as he gave chase. Despite being 53 years old, his daily 5-mile runs and strict fitness regimen meant he could still outpace most suspects. He began closing the distance, his breath coming in controlled bursts as he navigated the wet streets. The suspect, later identified as David Kowalski, was younger and desperate, but Marcus had experience and determination on his side. As they ran deeper into the warehouse district, Marcus realized this wasn't just some random shooter. The way Kowalski moved, the direction he was heading, suggested he knew this area well. What Marcus couldn't know was that Kowalski had been planning this attack for weeks. His ex-girlfriend, Maria Santos, volunteered at the community center, teaching English to immigrant families. When she had filed a restraining order against him after months of escalating domestic violence, Kowalski had snapped. He couldn't get to Maria directly, so he had decided to terrorize the place that represented her new life without him. 2 patrol cars had arrived at the community center from different directions. Officers Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen, both 5-year veterans with exemplary records, had been the first to respond to the shots-fired call. Morrison, 32, was a former Army medic who had joined the force to continue serving his community. Chen, 29, was a Detroit native whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan and who spoke fluent Mandarin and Spanish, skills that made him invaluable in the city's diverse neighborhoods. Both officers were good cops who cared deeply about their work, but they were also products of a system that had trained them to see threats everywhere, especially in neighborhoods like this one. As they arrived on scene, witnesses pointed frantically in different directions. The chaos was typical of an active shooter situation: conflicting information, scared civilians, and the desperate need to act quickly to prevent further casualties. Suspect fled on foot toward the warehouse district, Morrison radioed as he surveyed the scene. 3 people had been wounded by Kowalski's gunfire, all non-life-threatening injuries, but still requiring immediate medical attention. "We've got multiple victims here," Chen added, requesting additional EMS units. That's when they spotted Marcus. To Morrison and Chen, all they saw was a black male in dark clothing, running through the area where shots had been reported, approximately matching the suspect description. In the rain and darkness, with adrenaline pumping through their systems, they made the split-second decision that would change all their lives forever. "There!" Morrison shouted, pointing at Marcus, who was still pursuing the real suspect deeper into the warehouse district. "That's got to be our shooter." The tragic irony was that Marcus was actually getting closer to apprehending the real criminal when his own officers mistook him for the threat. Kowalski had ducked into an abandoned building just 50 yards ahead, but Marcus would never reach him. "Freeze, police! Get on the ground now!" The command cut through the rain like a blade. Marcus turned to see 2 officers with weapons drawn, their faces tense with concentration and fear. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Marcus faced the impossible choice that confronts every black man in America when stopped by police: comply immediately and hope for the best, or try to explain and risk being seen as non-compliant, or reaching for a weapon. Marcus's first instinct was to identify himself, but 23 years of police work had taught him how quickly these situations could escalate. He had seen too many body camera videos, read too many incident reports, attended too many funerals. "Officers, I'm Chief Williams, Detroit Metro PD," Marcus called out, slowly raising his hands while keeping his service weapon visible but pointed down. "I'm in pursuit of the actual suspect who fled into that warehouse." But his words were lost in the chaos of the moment. The rain hammered the pavement, sirens wailed in the distance, and Morrison and Chen were operating on pure adrenaline and training that told them to neutralize the threat first and ask questions later. Officer Chen keyed his radio. "We have the suspect in sight. Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, appears to be armed. He's not complying with verbal commands." Marcus tried again, his voice rising with urgency. "I'm a police officer. Detroit Metro Chief of Police. The real suspect went into that building." But Morrison was already moving forward with his taser drawn. His training had taught him that suspects often claimed to be police officers, that they would say anything to avoid arrest. What he didn't see was the badge clipped to Marcus's belt, hidden beneath his hoodie. "Last warning!" Morrison shouted. "Get down now!" Marcus realized with growing horror that the officers couldn't hear him properly over the storm, and even if they could, they might not believe him. He had no choice but to comply and hope that cooler heads would prevail once they got closer. As Marcus began to slowly kneel down, keeping his hands visible, his jacket shifted in the wind. The movement revealed his holstered service weapon, and in the poor visibility and high stress of the moment, it looked to the officers like he might be reaching for it. "Gun!" "He's got a gun!" Morrison yelled. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a car crash. Both officers rushed forward, Morrison deploying his taser while Chen moved to provide backup. 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through Marcus's body, sending him crashing to the wet pavement, with a force that knocked the wind from his lungs. Before he could recover, strong hands grabbed him, a knee pressed into his back and handcuffs clicked around his wrists with metallic finality. The cold steel cut into his skin as he was pressed against the rain-soaked asphalt, tasting blood from where his lip had split against the concrete. "You have the right to remain silent," Chen began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Marcus lay there, face pressed against the pavement where he had played as a child, now being arrested by officers under his own command. The irony was so bitter he could taste it mixing with the blood in his mouth. 23 years of service, countless lives saved, communities protected, reforms implemented, and here he was, living the nightmare that haunted every black man in America. "Check his ID," Morrison instructed Chen while maintaining pressure on Marcus's back. "Need to see who we're dealing with here." Chen reached into Marcus's jacket pocket, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline rush. He expected to find the usual items, maybe a driver's license with warrants, possibly drugs or stolen goods. What he found instead made his blood run cold. "Morrison," Chen's voice had gone quiet, barely audible over the rain. "Morrison, you need to see this right now." "What is it?" "Just run his ID and let's get him transported." Chen's face had gone pale as he stared at the leather wallet in his hands. Inside was a gold badge that seemed to glow under the streetlight. Detroit Metropolitan Police Department. Chief of Police Marcus J. Williams. Below it was a department ID with Marcus's photograph, his signature and his badge number. "Oh God," Chen whispered, his hands beginning to shake. "Oh my God, Morrison, we just arrested the chief of police." Morrison looked down at the badge, then at Marcus, then back at the badge. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, reality reorganizing itself around this devastating revelation. This wasn't some gang member or drug dealer they had taken down. This was their boss, the man who signed their paychecks, who had implemented the community policing reforms they had all been trained on, who had fought the mayor's office for better equipment and training. More than that, Marcus Williams was a legend in the department. He had been the youngest detective in Detroit history, had solved some of the city's most notorious cases, had been shot twice in the line of duty and returned both times. He was the officer other officers looked up to, the one who had proved that police work could be both effective and ethical. "Sir," Morrison's voice cracked as he immediately began removing the handcuffs, his hands fumbling with the key. "Chief Williams, sir, we didn't know. The rain, the darkness, the suspect description. We thought." Marcus slowly pushed himself up from the pavement, rain and blood mixing on his face. For a moment that felt like an hour, he said nothing, just looked at these two officers who had done exactly what their training had taught them to do. The anger he felt wasn't at them personally. It was at a system that had made this moment inevitable. "Help me up," Marcus said quietly. Both officers immediately moved to assist him, their faces stricken with guilt and disbelief. As Marcus stood, he could see the community center in the distance, where EMS workers were treating the actual victims of the shooting. He could also see curious onlookers beginning to gather, some with cell phones out, recording what would soon become a viral video. While Marcus was being helped to his feet and brushing debris from his clothes, the radio crackled with an update that made everyone's stomach drop. Suspect apprehended at the old Maxwell warehouse. White male David Kowalski, age 34, armed with a .38 revolver, currently in custody. The real shooter had been caught by officers Rodriguez and Kim, who had approached the warehouse district from the north. They had found Kowalski hiding in the building Marcus had been chasing him toward, still armed and ranting about his ex-girlfriend and the restraining order. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the rain wash the blood from his split lip. The system had worked in a way. The real criminal had been caught, the victims would recover and justice would be served. But another kind of injustice had been committed here on this street corner, one that cut to the heart of everything wrong with policing in America. "Sir," Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper, What do we do now?" Marcus looked at these two young officers, both good men who had joined the force to make a difference, now facing the possibility that their careers were over before they had really begun. He thought about the phone calls that would need to be made, the reports that would need to be filed, the media storm that was about to descend. But more than that, he thought about his grandson Jamal's question from dinner. "Will things be different when I'm old enough to join the force?" "Now," Marcus said, "we figure out how to make sure this never happens again." Within an hour, the incident had escalated through every level of the department hierarchy. Deputy Chief Williams, no relation to Marcus, arrived on scene, followed by internal affairs investigators, and then the mayor's office. The media got wind of the story by midnight, and by morning, it was trending on social media nationwide. The video recorded by bystanders was grainy and hard to see clearly, but it showed enough. A black man being tasered and arrested by police, then helped up and treated with obvious deference once his identity was discovered. The optics were devastating. Marcus spent the rest of that night in meetings, first with internal affairs, then with the mayor, then with community leaders who had gotten word of what happened. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. What was he going to do about Officers Morrison and Chen? The easy answer, the politically expedient answer, was to fire them immediately. They had made a catastrophic error in judgment that had embarrassed the department and given ammunition to critics of police reform. Any other response would be seen as protecting his own officers at the expense of justice. But Marcus knew something that the politicians and pundits didn't. He knew that Morrison and Chen were exactly the kind of officers the department needed: community-minded, well-trained, and genuinely committed to serving and protecting. Their mistake hadn't been born of malice or prejudice, but of a system that trained officers to see threats everywhere and react with overwhelming force. The next morning brought protests outside police headquarters. Some demanded that Morrison and Chen be fired and prosecuted. Others defended the officers, saying they had acted reasonably given the information they had. The incident became a Rorschach test for everyone's existing beliefs about police and race in America. Reverend Michael Johnson, a longtime civil rights activist and friend of Marcus's family, stood on the steps of City Hall and spoke to a crowd of several hundred people. "How many of our young men have been in Chief Williams's position?" he asked the gathering. "How many have been slammed to the ground, handcuffed and treated like criminals for the crime of being black in the wrong place at the wrong time? The only difference is that Chief Williams had a badge to show them. Our sons and daughters don't have that protection." The crowd murmured agreement, but Johnson wasn't finished. "But here's what we need to understand," he continued. "Chief Williams has spent his entire career fighting for the reforms we need. He's not the enemy here. The enemy is a system that makes good officers see danger where they should see community members. The enemy is training that teaches fear instead of understanding." Marcus watched the Reverend's speech from his office window, feeling the weight of expectation and responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Whatever decision he made about Morrison and Chen would send a message, not just to his department, but to communities across the country that were watching to see if real change was possible. The next day, Morrison and Chen requested a meeting with Marcus. They arrived at his office early in the morning, both looking like they hadn't slept. They carried resignation letters in their hands, their faces etched with shame and regret that seemed to age them years overnight. "Chief," Morrison began, his voice barely steady, "there's nothing we can say that makes this right. We failed you, we failed the department, and we failed the community. We're submitting our resignations effective immediately." Chen nodded, his own letter trembling in his hands. "Sir, we know that our careers are over and we accept that, but we want you to know that we joined this force because we believed in what you were trying to build here. We believed in community policing, in treating everyone with dignity and respect. What we did to you goes against everything we swore to uphold." Marcus looked at these two young officers, Morrison with his military bearing and genuine desire to serve, Chen with his language skills and deep connection to the immigrant communities that made up so much of Detroit's population. They were exactly the kind of officers that community policing required, and the system had failed them just as much as it had failed him. "Sit down," Marcus said quietly. For the next 2 hours, Marcus did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He talked. Including himself. He talked. Not as their chief, but as a black man who had experienced firsthand what they had put him through. He told them about growing up in neighborhoods where police were seen as an occupying force rather than community protectors. He told them about his own early days as a cop, when he had to prove himself twice as hard because of the color of his skin. He told them about the traffic stops where he had been pulled over while off duty, about the times when even his police ID hadn't immediately resolved the suspicion in other officers' eyes. He told them about the careful conversations he had had to have with his own children about how to interact with police, conversations that white parents rarely had to have with their kids. But then he told them something else, something that would change the trajectory of all their careers. 20 years ago, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, I responded to a domestic violence call in Corktown. Young white woman, maybe 25 years old. Her husband had been beating her for months, and the neighbors finally called it in. Morrison and Chen listened intently, unsure where this story was leading. When I got there, she took one look at me through the peephole and refused to open the door, said she didn't trust black cops, that we were all corrupt or in the pocket of her husband's dealer friends. She demanded that they send a white officer. Marcus paused, remembering the frustration and hurt he had felt in that moment. I could have been angry. I could have forced my way in, done my job despite her prejudice. Instead, I called for backup and specifically requested a white officer to assist. Officer Martinez, good cop, retired now, came to help. Together we convinced her to let us in. We documented her injuries, arrested her husband, and connected her with victim services. Chen frowned. But sir, why didn't you just do your job? Why accommodate her racism? Because, Marcus said, sometimes doing the right thing means acknowledging that the world isn't perfect and working within that reality to get the best outcome. That woman was a victim who needed help, and her prejudice, however wrong it was born from years of negative experiences with law enforcement in her neighborhood. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. What happened to me last night was wrong. But it wasn't malicious. It was the result of a system that has failed all of us. Black citizens who live in fear of police, officers who are trained to see threats everywhere, and communities that have been torn apart by decades of mistrust. Marcus turned back to face the two officers. I'm not accepting your resignations. Instead, I'm promoting you both. Morrison and Chen stared at Marcus in shock. This was the last thing they had expected, the last thing that made sense given what had happened. Sir, with all due respect, Chen said, how can you promote us after what we did to you? Marcus smiled for the first time since the incident. Because you did your job. You responded to a dangerous situation quickly and professionally. You used non-lethal force when you could have used deadly force. You followed your training to the letter. And when you realized your mistake, you immediately tried to make it right. He pulled 2 folders from his desk drawer, folders he had spent the morning preparing. I'm creating a new community integration unit, and I'm assigning you both to lead it. Your job will be to work directly with neighborhood leaders, particularly in communities where police relations are strained. You'll attend community meetings, participate in youth programs, help organize cultural events, and serve as liaisons between the department and the people we serve. Morrison looked confused and overwhelmed. Chief, why would you trust us with something like that after what happened? Because, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, you now understand something that can't be taught in a classroom or learned from a manual. You understand how it feels to make a mistake that could have had devastating consequences. You understand the weight of that badge and the responsibility it carries. And most importantly, you understand that every person you encounter is someone's son, daughter, father, or mother, not just a potential threat. Marcus sat back down, his expression serious but hopeful. You made a mistake based on assumptions and fear. Now I'm giving you the chance to build something based on understanding and trust. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work of earning forgiveness and building something better? Both officers accepted their new assignments, though not without reservations. The community integration unit started small, just Morrison and Chen working out of a cramped office in the basement of headquarters. Their first task was to attend a community meeting at the very center where Marcus had been arrested. The meeting was hostile from the start. Residents who had heard about the incident were angry and suspicious. Many had their own stories of negative encounters with police, and the arrest of Chief Williams had confirmed their worst fears about how black men were treated by law enforcement. So you're the ones who arrested our police chief, said Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 60 years. And now they send you here to make nice? What's next? You're going to tell us it was all a big misunderstanding? Morrison stood up, his hands clasped behind his back in the military position of attention he unconsciously assumed when nervous. Ma'am, you're right to be angry. What we did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. We came here tonight not to make excuses, but to listen and to try to understand how we can do better. The room erupted in shouts and arguments. Some residents demanded that the officers leave immediately. Others wanted to hear what they had to say. The meeting threatened to dissolve into chaos, until an unexpected voice called for order. "Let them talk," said Marcus's daughter Sarah, who ran literacy programs at the community center. "Let's hear what they have to say, and then we'll decide if they're worth our time." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations Morrison and Chen had ever been part of. For 2 hours, residents shared their experiences with police, traffic stops that turned humiliating, searches based on nothing more than location and skin color, interactions where officers saw criminals instead of community members. Chen heard from Mrs. Liu, an elderly Taiwanese immigrant who was afraid to call police when teenagers vandalized her store because she didn't trust that officers would take her seriously or treat her with respect. Morrison listened to Jerome Patterson, a 19-year-old who had been stopped and searched 17 times in the past year while walking to his job at a local grocery store. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle that helped the officers understand why their mistake with Marcus was just one incident in a long pattern of broken trust between police and the communities they were supposed to protect. "Here's what I don't understand," said Reverend Johnson, who had attended the meeting as both a community leader and a friend of Marcus's family. "You officers, you seem like decent men. So how does this keep happening? How do good cops keep making the same mistakes?" It was Chen who answered, his voice quiet but thoughtful. "Because we're trained to see danger first and ask questions later. Because we're taught that officer safety is the highest priority, even if it means treating innocent people like criminals. Because the system rewards us for arrests and stops, not for building relationships and trust." The room went quiet. This was perhaps the first time many residents had heard a police officer acknowledge the systemic nature of the problems they faced. Morrison added, "We can't change what happened to Chief Williams, but we can work to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. If you'll let us." Slowly, tentatively, relationships began to form. Mrs. Washington invited the officers to attend her weekly senior citizens meetings, where elderly residents shared their concerns about crime and safety. Chen started attending cultural events in the city's various immigrant communities, learning about their specific needs and challenges. Morrison organized a youth basketball league, partnering with local high schools to provide positive activities for teenagers after school. The league became a place where young people could interact with police officers in a non-threatening environment, seeing them as coaches and mentors rather than authority figures to be feared. The real breakthrough came 3 months after the program started. During what became known as the Riverside incident, it was another Tuesday night, another rainstorm, when gunshots rang out near the community center again. This time, Morrison and Chen were the first officers on scene, but they weren't alone. 3 community volunteers who had been working with them in the integration program were also present, including Sarah Williams, who had stayed late to prepare for the next day's literacy classes. The situation was volatile and familiar. A young black man named DeAndre Johnson had been shot by unknown assailants and was bleeding on the sidewalk outside the center. Community members were gathering quickly, angry and suspicious of police presence. The crowd was growing, and tensions were rising by the minute. Morrison and Chen faced a choice that would define their careers and the future of the integration program. They could call for backup and wait, potentially letting DeAndre bleed out while maintaining their own safety and following standard protocol. Or they could trust the relationships they had been building over the past 3 months and act. They chose trust. "Sarah," Chen called out to Marcus's daughter, recognizing her as someone who could bridge the gap between police and community. "We need to get to DeAndre to help him, but the crowd won't let us through. Can you help us?" Sarah looked at the 2 officers who had arrested her father 6 months earlier, then at the bleeding young man on the ground. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on her. These same officers on this same street, now asking for her help to save a life instead of taking one into custody. She made her choice. "Everyone listen," Sarah shouted to the crowd, her voice carrying the authority that came from being both a community member and the police chief's daughter. "These officers are here to help DeAndre. I know them. I work with them, and right now we need to let them save his life." The crowd hesitated, then slowly parted. Morrison and Chen rushed to DeAndre, immediately applying pressure to his wounds and coordinating with the paramedics who arrived moments later. Because of their quick action and the community's unprecedented cooperation, DeAndre survived what could have been a fatal shooting. But the real story was just beginning. As DeAndre recovered in Detroit Receiving Hospital, the investigation into his shooting revealed something that shocked everyone involved. The shooters weren't rival gang members or drug dealers. As many had initially assumed, they were three white supremacists from a suburb 30 miles away who had targeted the community center specifically because of its diverse programming and its role in Marcus's police reform efforts. The attack had been planned for weeks. The shooters, led by 26-year-old Bradley Morrison, no relation to Officer Morrison, had been monitoring the center's activities through social media, looking for an opportunity to send a message of hate to Detroit's integrated communities. They had chosen Tuesday night because they knew the center would be busy with literacy classes, youth programs, and community meetings. Their goal wasn't just to hurt people, but to terrorize a community that had become a symbol of successful police-community collaboration. Marcus visited DeAndre in the hospital, along with Morrison and Chen. The young man, barely 19 years old, looked up at the three officers with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Why y'all here?" DeAndre asked weakly, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "I ain't never trusted cops before this." Morrison pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed, his expression serious but warm. "6 months ago I made a terrible mistake. I arrested a good man because I was afraid and acted on my assumptions instead of facts. Since then I've been trying to do better, to be better." Chen nodded, his own voice soft with emotion. "We both have. And when we saw you hurt last night, we didn't see a suspect or a threat. We saw someone who needed help, someone who mattered to this community." DeAndre looked at Marcus, recognition dawning in his eyes. "You the chief, right? The one they arrested?" "Yes, I am." "And you still work with these guys? After what they did?" Marcus sat down on the other side of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "DeAndre, hate is easy. Revenge is easy. Forgiveness is hard. But building something better than what we have, that's the hardest thing of all. These officers made a mistake, but they've spent every day since then trying to make it right. That's not something you see very often in police work or in life." DeAndre was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was hearing. Finally, he asked a question that would change the trajectory of the entire reform program. "Can I help?" DeAndre's question became the catalyst for something unprecedented in American policing. Despite having been shot by white supremacists targeting his community, despite having every reason to distrust law enforcement, he became one of the most vocal advocates for the Community Integration Unit. His story, of how Officers Morrison and Chen had saved his life, of how they had worked to build trust rather than fear, spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Other young people began to take notice. If DeAndre Johnson, who had grown up with gang members and drug dealers, could work with police, maybe they could too. The community center, where so much pain had occurred, became a place of healing. Regular meetings between officers and residents became standing room-only events. The basketball league that Morrison had started grew from 12 participants to over 100. Chen's cultural exchange programs brought together immigrant families and police officers for shared meals and language lessons. Marcus watched these developments with a mixture of pride and amazement. What had started as one of the worst nights of his career was becoming something transformative for the entire department and community. But the real test was yet to come. Word of Detroit's Community Integration Unit began to spread beyond the city limits. Police departments from across the country sent delegations to study the program. Academic researchers requested access to conduct studies. Civil rights organizations, initially skeptical, began to cautiously endorse the approach. The breakthrough moment came when the Department of Justice, under pressure to address nationwide concerns about police-community relations, designated Detroit as a pilot city for a new federal initiative on community policing reform. Marcus found himself testifying before Congress, explaining how a moment of crisis had become an opportunity for transformation. But he insisted that Morrison, Chen, and DeAndre testify alongside him. "The lesson here isn't that mistakes don't matter," Marcus told the House Judiciary Committee. "The lesson is that what we do after we make mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves." Representative Janet Collins of California, a longtime critic of police reform efforts, challenged Marcus directly. "Chief Williams, with all due respect, you're asking us to believe that arresting you was somehow a good thing. How do we know this isn't just good public relations covering up the same old problems?" It was DeAndre who answered, his voice steady despite the intimidating setting of the congressional hearing room. "Congresswoman, 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in Washington, D.C. defending police officers, I would have said they were crazy. I grew up thinking cops were the enemy. But these officers, Morrison and Chen, they showed me something different. They showed me that police can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." He paused, looking directly at the Congresswoman. "The question isn't whether Chief Williams getting arrested was good or bad. The question is whether we're going to use moments like that to build something better, or whether we're going to keep doing the same things and expecting different results." 1 year after Marcus's arrest, the department organized a community policing summit that drew representatives from across the country. The event was held at the newly renovated community center, which had been expanded and redesigned to serve as a model for police-community collaboration. Marcus was scheduled to give the keynote address, but he surprised everyone by calling Morrison, Chen, and DeAndre to the stage with him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, "a year ago I was arrested by 2 of my own officers. It was humiliating, painful, and wrong, but it was also the beginning of something I never could have imagined." He gestured to Morrison and Chen, who stood slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but proud of what they had accomplished. These officers made a mistake based on fear and assumptions. Instead of letting that mistake define them or destroy their careers, they chose to learn from it. They chose to be better. Then he looked at DeAndre, who had enrolled in community college and was studying criminal justice with plans to become a police officer himself. This young man was shot by people who wanted to spread hate and division in our community. Instead of letting that hate consume him, he chose to work for understanding and change. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued, addressing the hundreds of law enforcement officials, community leaders, and activists in the audience. What we learned that night is that trust isn't built in moments of peace and cooperation. It's built in moments of crisis, when we choose to see each other's humanity instead of our differences. It's built when we choose to build bridges instead of walls. The audience was silent, absorbing the weight of his words. The real criminal that night wasn't the man with the gun who was eventually arrested. It wasn't the officers who made an honest mistake. The real criminal is the system of fear and mistrust that makes such mistakes inevitable. And the only way to defeat that criminal is to work together, police and community. Black and white, all of us committed to something better than what we inherited. The story of that rainy Tuesday night and its aftermath spread far beyond Detroit. Police academies across the country began using the case as a training example, not just of what can go wrong, but of how to make things right when they do go wrong. Morrison and Chen became sought-after speakers at law enforcement conferences, sharing their experience and the lessons they had learned. Their message was simple but powerful. Mistakes are inevitable, but learning from them is a choice. DeAndre's transformation from victim to advocate inspired similar programs in other cities. Young people who had been failed by the system began to see possibilities for change and improvement. But for Marcus, the most meaningful changes were smaller and more personal. 3 years after the incident, Marcus's grandson Jamal turned 18 and graduated high school. Like many black teenagers, Jamal had grown up with a complicated relationship with police, proud of his grandfather's service, but acutely aware of the dangers that came with his skin color in America. One evening, Jamal was walking home from his job at a local restaurant when he was stopped by a police officer. The officer was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area and wanted to question anyone he saw. But instead of the confrontation Marcus had always feared, something different happened. The officer, a recent academy graduate who had been trained in the new community policing model, recognized Jamal as Chief Williams' grandson and struck up a friendly conversation about his college plans. More importantly, he treated Jamal with the respect and dignity that every young person deserves, regardless of their family connections. When Jamal got home and told his grandfather about the encounter, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years, genuine hope that things were truly changing. not just in policy and procedure, but in the hearts and minds of the officers who served his community. The transformation wasn't limited to individual attitudes or even departmental policies. It represented a fundamental shift in how police and community members saw their relationship with each other. The Community Integration Unit expanded from 2 officers to 20, then to 50. Every new recruit was required to spend a month working in the unit before being assigned to patrol duties. Community members were involved in hiring decisions, training programs, and policy development. Other departments across the country began implementing similar programs. The model that had grown out of one terrible mistake became a blueprint for police reform nationwide. Academic studies began to show measurable improvements in police-community relations, reductions in use-of-force incidents, and increased clearance rates for serious crimes. When people trusted police, they were more likely to report crimes and cooperate with investigations. But Marcus knew that the real victory wasn't in the statistics or the academic papers. It was in moments like the one with his grandson. Moments when a black teenager could interact with police without fear, when an officer could see a young person as someone to protect rather than someone to suspect. 5 years after that rainy night, Marcus stood in the same spot where he had been arrested. But this time he wasn't alone. Morrison and Chen were with him, along with DeAndre, now Officer Johnson, having graduated from the police academy with honors. Sarah was there too, along with dozens of community members who had become partners in the ongoing work of building trust and understanding. They were dedicating a new community policing station built on the site where the old warehouse had stood. The building would serve as headquarters for the expanded Community Integration Unit and as a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear, bridge building over wall building. As Marcus cut the ribbon, he thought about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. If he hadn't been wearing that hoodie, if the officers had recognized him immediately, if the real shooter had been caught before the confusion began, any of those changes might have prevented the arrest, but they also might have prevented everything that came after. "Chief," Morrison said as the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, "do you ever regret what happened that night?" Marcus considered the question carefully, looking around at the faces of people who had once been strangers, or even enemies, now working together toward common goals. He thought about the pain and humiliation of that night, about the months of controversy and criticism that followed. He thought about the community meetings, where people had screamed at him for not firing the officers, and the police union meetings where he had been accused of betraying his own officers. But then he looked at what had been built from that moment of crisis. He saw former enemies working together as partners. He saw young people who viewed police as protectors and mentors rather than threats to be feared. He saw officers who understood their role as community guardians rather than occupying forces. He thought about DeAndre, who had transformed from a shooting victim into a police officer dedicated to serving the community where he had almost died. He thought about Morrison and Chen, who had turned their worst mistake into their greatest contribution to law enforcement. He thought about his grandson, who could now walk the streets without fear of being seen as a threat simply because of his skin color. "No," Marcus said finally, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "I don't regret it, because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that happens to everyone else." As the sun set over Detroit, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Marcus reflected on the long journey that had brought them all to this point. The arrest had lasted only minutes, but its impact would last for generations. Children who grew up seeing police and community members working together would carry that expectation into their own adulthood. Officers trained in the new model would train others, spreading the principles of trust and understanding throughout law enforcement. The real victory wasn't that Marcus had been vindicated or that Morrison and Chen had redeemed themselves. The real victory was structural and cultural, a transformation in how an entire city thought about the relationship between police and the people they served. That night, as Marcus drove home past the community center where it all began, he saw something that made him smile. A group of teenagers were playing basketball under the lights, and 2 officers, one of whom he recognized as a recent academy graduate from DeAndre's class, had joined the game. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the history, but to Marcus, It represented everything they had worked for. A world where the sight of police in a community wasn't a cause for fear, but for hope. The rain began to fall again as Marcus pulled into his driveway, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like a blessing, washing away the old divisions and watering the seeds of something better. Something that had grown from the worst moment of his career into the best legacy he could leave behind. In the end, that's what justice looked like in the real world. Not perfect, not immediate, but persistent. Not about punishment alone, but about transformation and growth. Not about who was right or wrong in any single moment, but about what was possible when people chose to build bridges instead of walls. And it all started with a terrible mistake on a rainy Tuesday night, when two good officers arrested their chief, and everyone involved chose to make something beautiful from something broken. The badge that had been hidden under a hoodie had become a symbol not of division, but of the possibility of redemption, growth, and hope. Did this incredible story of transformation and second chances move you? If you believe in the power of people to change, to grow, and to build something beautiful from something broken, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We're still working toward that 1,000 subscriber goal. And stories like Chief Williams's remind us that the most powerful changes often start with the most painful moments. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and help us share more stories of hope, justice, and the incredible power of redemption. Your support helps us bring you the content that matters most, real stories about real people making real change in their communities.